Good morning. Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, a policy-oriented and research-based think tank in NCR, welcomes Dr. Arvind Virmani, Member NITI Aayog, Professor Ramesh Chand, Member NITI Aayog, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Member Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, former ED, IMF, Mr. Ajay Shakar, former Secretary, Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Professor Goldar from Institute of Economic Growth, and Professor Amitabh Kundu, Jawaharlal Nehru University on the dais. It's our privilege to welcome ambassadors from Sudan, and we are expecting ambassadors from Angola, Chad, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Kyrgyzstan, Lithuania, Mongolia, Namibia, Seychelles, South Sudan, and Eritrea. We are also expecting charge d'affaires from Gabon and Georgia, and diplomats from Egypt, Ethiopia, Gambia, Republic of Korea, Russia, Thailand, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Togo. We know there are lots of traffic hassles today, but we want to start in time because the house is packed. Our hearty welcome to Madam Aarti Ahuja, Ministry of Labour and Employment Secretary, Shri N Sinha, Secretary, Ministry of Steel, Srimati Meeta Lochan, Secretary, Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, and officials from other ministries and departments of Government of India, including very young officers just recruited, undergoing training at IEG, young officers from Indian Economic Service. I would also like to welcome my friends from the government, diplomatic corps, academics, and media. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to discuss a very important issue, the Indian model of economic growth and development. As you would agree with me, the growth model evolves over time amidst changing circumstances. It's dynamic. India initially followed a mixed economy pattern as we got our freedom based on mixture of socialist and capitalist ideology. The role of the government was predominant then, as would be expected, given the size of the population below the poverty line and hundreds of years of a foreign rule. The country was able to consolidate its position, develop industry and agriculture, as also build a robust financial sector in 4 decades of independence. The reforms in 1991 liberalized the economy, with the share of the role of private sector becoming significant. But a sharp turn around 2014 happened in our country, when the Planning Commission was dissolved and NITI Aayog evolved. It started, it fostered, it encouraged cooperative federalism. While the private sector was encouraged, financial inclusion happened for the unbanked Indians on a mission mode. Then nearly 50% of the population did not have a bank account. The use of technology for inclusivity of growth was also emphasized in the last 10 years. To discuss all these issues, IGRO Foundation for a couple of years has been considering publishing, conducting webinars on the uniqueness of the Indian growth model. Sorry for this. It's an opportunity. We all need to probably put our phones on airplane mode. We've been conducting webinars emphasizing the role of public policy and unique ideology underlying the growth pattern of our country. Today's conference aims to celebrate India's unique story of a blend of various philosophies to ensure a stable and steady growth, ensuring substantial number of people emerging out of poverty and leading a healthy life and finding suitable employment opportunities. The growth model that we are going to be discussing today speaks about sustainability and more importantly, about intergenerational sustainability. The pace of development in the consolidation phase might have been slow, but in recent years, in the last decade, despite the most difficult challenges, India has emerged as the beacon of stability and an engine of growth in the world. The philosophy behind this success needs to be celebrated and shared. To understand what is India's unique growth model and its uniqueness, we have invited some of the sharpest minds in our country today. Let me begin by inviting Dr. Arvind Virmani, known to all of us, member NITI Aayog, to deliver the keynote address on the subject. Dr. Virmani.
Thank you, Charan, for inviting me to give this address. So, given that, as you told me, you would like to finish by 1, I'm going to be very succinct and focused, so I won't get into all kinds of... what is it? My motive here is to give you an idea of how this differs from other models of growth and development. So, basically, India's model of inclusive growth has 3 broad elements. One is what one can call the index market economy. The second is what I term, I don't know what everybody else will term as Antodaya empowerment. You know, it's useful to have these brief words to stick in your mind, and then the details obviously vary. And the third element is what I call macro pragmatism, or non-ideological approach to difficult macro issues. So what is the index market economy? Why is it different? Well, it recognizes the strengths and weaknesses of both government and private sector. It recognizes that things are not static. They keep changing over time. So you have to adapt and evolve the model. And it tries to exploit the strength of the market and the government while skirting the weakness. What is Antodaya empowerment? I think in some ways, we compare with kind of the European middle way, and in my view, the difference is that it accounts for the incredible diversity of India, that is Bharat. In Europe, we see different models because they are different countries, 30 countries, 50 countries. In our case, all of these are within one country. So the diversity is what this element tries to do, and in my view, quite successfully. And finally, the macro pragmatism, that one is open to all kinds of ideas like classical, neoclassical, heterodox in the literature. There are lots of things. But the idea we have is we are open because at different times, because of differences in history and types of shocks, different elements of these may be valid and applicable. So that is where the pragmatism comes in understanding what is happening, the differences, and applying it differently, not being stuck in a particular model. And of course, all this within a constitutional federal plural democracy, which you're all aware of. Now, one of the key differentiators, as I pointed out, and say a little bit of this, is the role of government and sector. As Dr. Charan Singh pointed out, some of this has evolved over time, but the basic feature of our model is that it shuns ideological extremes and seeks the middle ground. And as of now, for example, some of the important elements of this is the public-private partnership, where, as far as I know, we have gone much further than most countries in the world. So private sector is the driver of economic growth and employment, and it must compete, invest, and innovate. But the government must create the environment for micro-efficiency and sustained growth of employment and incomes. It must provide the public goods and infrastructure. So the role of the government and private sector is a key element or differentiator of this model. And of course, there is also a role for public and non-profit partnerships. A little bit more on the Indic market economy before we move on to the second element. As I indicated in the introduction, the idea is to use the strengths of the government and the private sector and to shun their weaknesses, to use one to compensate for the weaknesses. Generally, in an ideological framework, there are extremes. Some countries believe that markets are everything, and governments always have a negative role. And then, of course, there are the opposite who feel that government can run everything. So it's an effort to find a middle path, which is what we have done. So what does it mean? It means that we use competitive markets to incentivize and discipline the private sector. The market, if it is competitive, if you promote competition, competition itself disciplines. You don't have to have the heavy hand of the government. So decontrol, de-bureaucratization, domestic economy is very important. The open economy is now important in this 21st century, which it may not have been 50 years ago, 100 years ago, because the open economy also helps introduce competition to demonopolize the tradable goods sectors technically. I don't want to get too much into technical, but I think it's important because there are also non-tradable goods sectors which are characterized by infrastructure externalities. And so the idea has been to unbundle them, break them into parts, and introduce competition wherever there's feasible. So it is not that we just put things into bins due to ideological reasons, but always looking for opportunities for competition, creating competition, and the government filling in the gaps, filling in where the private sector cannot or will not do. Another example, so the electricity generation, distribution, transmission is one example of that. You unbundle it, and then you try to get private competition wherever that's possible. Auctioning. Natural resources. We know there are certain issues of rent, etc. Again, I don't want to get technical, but the auction, competitive auctions are a solution to this problem which we know is an economic problem, how to value natural resources. So again, just an example of how we are constantly looking for ways to introduce competition. And then, of course, regulate actual and potential monopolies. So whatever is left, which cannot be subject to competition, it has to be regulated. So that is one element of it. The other side of it is that, which I said, that what is it that government must do? So unlike many countries in the West, we believe that we have to improve imperfect markets, create missing markets. So examples of that is the agricultural ENAM, because agricultural markets are not very good in India for various reasons. We need not go into technical details, but those have to be created. So rural market institutions like cooperatives, etc. So constantly the government is looking to fill the gaps in the markets. So on the one hand, introduce competition, get the private sector to play the role. On the other hand, create the markets where they don't exist. So informal labor markets, the Shram portal is an example of that. The second element of this is information asymmetries. Again, a very technical thing, but some of you may know Professor Stiglitz was the first to get a Nobel Prize for this, but in many areas there's a problem of information, health and education. In education, we have created a portal, a platform called Diksha. It's really an amazing platform, and I say this because 9 months ago, when I was not in government, I was totally unaware of it, and I have been so impressed by it. I would tell all of you who are connected to education to go and look at that platform. It's an amazing platform for education. And then public, PPP, etc., skills. NSDC was created. There's an Atal Innovation Mission. So again, the idea is that we are looking for ways to create these markets which they don't exist, and also to solve these information asymmetries wherever there's an information problem. And of course, the usual financial regulators, etc. So with that background on this segment of it, before I go to the second segment, so what has been done in the last 10 years, policy reform, it's systematic. So systematically where the areas were left unreformed, we have searched whether it is products and services, so atomic energy, space, drone policy, so places where there had not been enough attention, not enough liberalization with the private. Remember, it's all connected to what I said earlier, to get the private initiatives. And of course, factor markets, which had not, in products, of course, agriculture is a big thing. Again, I don't want to go straight into controversies, but an NBR paper has shown that there was a possibility of 38% improvement in incomes of farmers by that kind of reform. This is an NBR paper. Perhaps my friend, the member for agriculture, may talk about related things. And reform of the public sector. So systematically look at gaps where the competitive markets have not been created, where the problems exist, and try to solve them. I'm not saying everything is perfect. I'm not saying everything has been solved, but the attempt, the approach has been to do that. Institutional reform, IBC, MPC, GST, you all heard of that. The new initiatives in abolishing outdated laws, decriminalizing economic laws. Again, many people, let's say 20 years ago, didn't realize how laws and rules related to them influence economic behavior. So this is another thing, to systematically look at things which are not working. And here, my friend will tell you a little bit more about these aspects. Bureaucratic reform, EODB, EORC, you've heard of, social welfare reform, the public goods, rural-urban differences, etc. So go through it systematically, not saying everything has been solved, but there is an attempt to do that systematically. Digital public goods, you've all heard of. Just for the record, I'll go through it quickly. The unique ID for citizens, the UPI, India Stack, etc. Electronic markets I've already referred to. So public goods are something the government has to provide. This is classic theory, not done in other countries. We, again, don't want to go into the details. So what is the result? You can say all this stuff has been done. It's not perfect, but what is the result? So just a few results here. India's per capita income, GDP, PPP, relative and poverty rate, very briefly. Relative to the world, in 2004, we were 0.25 of the world average of per capita income. In 2022, we are 0.4. So little less than doubling of the per capita average relative to the world. So of course, the world is moving. We are moving faster. So we are going up in the ratio. India's rank has, over the same period, gone up from 148 to 142 to 128. Poverty. These are estimates that we did, myself, Dr. Bhalla and others. And basically, what is called the absolute poverty, $1.9 a day, has gone from 33% to 7.4 to about 2.5 before the pandemic. And even the what may be called middle income poverty has gone from 73% to 43% to 26%. So overall, absolute poverty is virtually eliminated. Lower income poverty is down to roughly 18% before the pandemic. Employment and real wages. You read a lot of stuff about employment is getting worse and worse. That is just not borne out by the data. Very briefly, we have very good, consistent data from 2017-18 to 2022. That is why I picked these dates. So employment has grown by an average of about 2.3% per year. Real wages of casual workers has grown by 5.1% a year. Why casual workers? Because they are the baseline unskilled workers. You know, when we judge, when we talk about K-shaped recovery, etc., these are the people you are concerned about, right? The casual workers, the lowest rung of the workers, and their real wages have gone up by, on an average, over this period. In particular years, you can always discuss and debate and so on. Okay, so second element of the thing is Antodaya. This has two key elements. One is on this slide and one on the next one. One is the welfare of the poorest, less able, etc., the less fortunate. And this is in some sense connected with our millennial civilization. I won't expound on that, but it's multidimensional, multifaceted, and it looks at everything, including gender imbalances, of course, caste things, occupations, achievements. So, as somebody who trained in the West, our tendency to think of income transfers as the solution to all. Myself, I have written articles on this, and along with my friends, some of them on the dais. But I think the Indian approach is that we don't want to leave anybody behind. So if you look at it from a Western perspective, there are too many programs, okay? We are trying to reach everybody, okay? But I think this is actually the Indian approach. It's driven by, democracy is driven by a number of things. So that is kind of unique in India. And of course, the second element of this empowerment, which has developed over time, this attitude or approach was not there right from the beginning. Again, Dr. Charan Singh has outlined how things evolved. They have evolved. It's not that this whole thing was static. So provision of basic needs to every citizen, of course, is an old thing which is taken to new dimensions like sanitation, fuel, etc. But the other element of this is empowerment of every section of society. Okay? So this is a very, I think, an Indian approach, that we don't want to leave any section of segment behind. Again, I'm not saying it's all been achieved. I'm not saying we are perfect. I'm just saying this is the attitude, this is the approach, that we don't want any visible segment of the population to be left behind. I think this is quite unique, and what I call the Bhartiya model or whatever. So empower every section, whether it's financial access, education, entrepreneurship. I mentioned the Atal Innovation Mission. And then, of course, social sector, the community support, the NGOs have to be involved, at the ground level. They are really a bureaucracy which is centralized, whether it's the state or the union, cannot reach the bottom, in the villages and all, where the people who really need help are there. It has to be in cooperation with the NGOs. So again, what is the result? This is a table on multidimensional poverty. All these indicators are international indicators, except for the last two at the bottom, which is assets and bank accounts, which we feel are very important. And all of these have improved. The green portion tells you the change. I presented this table at a seminar in IIM Bangalore a few weeks ago, and one of the persons asked, this is all you hand waving. Well, no. These surveys this is the fifth and fourth survey, and these are done by the Indian Institute of Population Studies. They've been in business for decades, okay? This is not government data. And this shows that across the board, in the poorest states, this multidimensional poverty has gone down. Okay, so the final point on pragmatism, here I rush, it's more technical, and probably non-economists would have less interest in it, but I think a few things need to point it out. One is this, as I said, conservative, eclectic macro management. So fiscal aspects demonstrated in how we managed the effects of the pandemic, where very consciously we did targeting. We knew that just throwing money and expanding the fiscal deficit would create future problems. So focused, targeted approach. When all the world was saying that, we are spending, 10%, 20%, 30% of our budget, you're not doing anything. But it was conscious and it worked and it produced results. Similarly, monetary and credit, we pay a lot more attention to banking. I gave you those two asset thing, and what I mentioned, the two indicators that bringing the financial system down to the public, to everybody, we feel is an important element of this empowerment and focused credit policy. So again, this proved to be very useful in targeting to those who needed it. And the strategic industry policy, technical, so I won't get into it, but very important for the future. And the similar pragmatism, there's often criticism on trade policy. Again, I don't think it is perfect, but it's evolved over time, Make in India to Atmanirbhar, and now increasingly giving attention to the export aspects and the international competition. If you recall, I mentioned in the beginning that global competition is also important. This area has evolved, and the bottom line test is pragmatism. Does it work or doesn't it work? That is why I want to emphasize that's a good example. If I am able to find that X and Y policy doesn't work, I can go to my boss and tell him, no, sir, this does not work, and it will be changed. Again, I'm saying it apocryphically, but that's the point I want to make. It is not ideology. It is, does it work? We have a certain objective. If it doesn't work, get rid of it or change it. So industrial, the production link incentive, which is a very good thing, especially if it is combined with the export benchmark in efficiency, which we've learned from many countries in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that is very important benchmark. Industrial structure, urban infrastructure and management, we'll hear more about urban in a little while. So to conclude, looking forward into the future, which is a talk in itself, but where is all this leading to? So the idea is a Viksit Bharat in 2050, which is basically a developed country, India, a high-income country by mid-century, average quality of life of EU at the turn of the century. Sustained fast growth in per capita income is critical for this to happen. So is equality of opportunity for all citizens. You hear a lot about X% of women out of the labor force. I think an important part of this approach is to bring women into the labor force, because there's a huge unused resource. I mean, if you forget even if you don't focus on the social aspects of it, just in pure economic terms, it's a huge resource which can allow us to grow much faster by women coming into the labor force and working. Just pure pragmatism and economics. So so I'm not downplaying the social part of it, but it's just this aspect. So digital economy, this is a key element which I didn't have time to speak a lot more about, but there are two big elements which we are focusing on, which as far as I know has never happened anywhere else. One is to use the economy to provide high quality social services, whether it's health, whether it's governance, whether it's education. I gave you the example of Diksha earlier. And the other is the upgrade, sorry, the Diksha comes in the upgrading of human resources. So what is the element here? India's population is twice the total population of US and EU combined. It'll take us 50 years, 100 years to come up to that quality. So the digital economy will be used to upgrade these faster. Now, of course, you cannot go to 100% by being just digital, because we know from many studies that the personal touch is very important for educating, but you can go 80% of the way by using this. And finally, and this is quite important because a lot of people seem to think that there's a contradiction between power and income. It's a paradox. It's not a contradiction. By 2047, India will clearly be the third most economically powerful country, but our income rank will still be around 90. Don't take those numbers literally, it's just an indicator. So where is the paradox? Well, it's a paradox, not a contradiction, because for the first time in a long history, maybe over the last 1,000 years, there'll be two countries whose population is 4 times the population of the next largest country. That's the reason for the paradox. So our per capita income only has to be 1/4 of that of USA, which is the third largest country, to be equal in economic power, so to say. I'm talking again very roughly. So it's not a contradiction. The fact that there are 90 countries will be a developed country or a high-income country, but there'll still be 90 others or 50, 60, 80, whatever countries which have more per capita income. But some of these may be a size of 100,000 people, another maybe 1 million. So it is not a contradiction. It's a paradox. Thank you.
I must thank Dr. Virmani to have given an outline of the paper that has been published in NITI Aayog very recently, the Bhartiya Model of Inclusive Development Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, and Sabka Prayas. And that is what he emphasized in the different aspects of the growth model that India has followed under pragmatism, under Antyodaya. Nobody should be left behind. The whole country is moving forward, should be moving forward. At the end of the day, it is the labor and capital that's available in the country. How to optimally utilize it, nothing is unemployed, everything is engaged in moving forward. With this, the keynote paper is in front of you. And now we are going to look at various aspects about the growth model that India has been following. Let me invite Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. He is member of the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, and he is going to be talking about process reforms. Mr. Sanyal, please.
Thank you very much, Charan, and a very good morning to all of you. It's indeed a pleasure to be here to speak about the issue of reforms. I'm going to speak a little bit about process reforms. Now, the question is, what on earth is process reforms, and how is it different from any other kind of reforms? Now, most of the time when you hear the term reform in academia, policy circles, or in the general public, media, and so on, what we are really referring to is structural reforms. Now, these are reforms that change the framework in which a particular economy functions. So, whether it's GST, or the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, or the inflation targeting framework, or the original liberalization of the economy and the removal of the license permit system, and so on. These are structural reforms. Why? Because they change the structure of the economy. So the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, what does it do? It creates a framework for creative destruction. GST, what does it do? Well, it creates a common market. It's a free trade agreement India signed with itself. The inflation targeting framework, it changed the framework in which the monetary policy is managed and how we try to control inflation and maintain macro stability. But there is another entire class of reforms called process reforms. Now, these are not the very cool reforms that everybody reads about usually in the newspapers. Most of these come in, somewhere in the inside pages if they are reported at all. But they refer to all these nuts and bolts reforms that cumulatively have enormous impact on the efficiency of an economy. So they take for granted the framework, which the structural reforms do, or if you haven't reformed it, that's the structure that exists. But this is about, changing rule number 43C subsection D. And very often that has multiplier effects through the system. So now this has become an important part of the agenda of how we are now going to do reforms. Now, it's not that we haven't been doing this all these years, but because structural reforms are now beginning to settle the basic framework of the economy, now 30 years of doing market-oriented reforms means the basic structure is there. What we now need to begin doing is to getting all these nuts and bolts going in order to get that system functioning. And there are lots and lots of these reforms, and we have done some of them in the recent past, and I'll give you a few that we are doing now and few that we will do in the near future, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of reforms we are doing. So one example of a process reform that has been quite successful is the reform of something called OSP, Other Service Provider reforms in the telecom sector. Now, I'm very certain that there will be no more than 5 or 6 people. How many of you even know about what these OSP reforms were? 2 people over there. Okay, so there's very, very few people who know this. But yet, if you were in the IT and IT-enabled services, this was a very critical reform we did in the middle of COVID, actually, in 2020-21. So what were these reforms? So they were actually these extremely onerous rules that anybody using an IT or an IT-enabled platform to do business was supposed to comply with in order to do business. So technically, till this reform was done, work from home actually was illegal. So all of you were doing something illegal when you were working from home. The laws required that you had to have an EPA BX machine in your basement in order to use the telecom system to do some work. So these rules actually existed as recently as the end of 2020, early 2021. And while the average person may not care about this, if you happen to be a BPO, for example, you had to actually get permission from the telecom ministry every time you did even some minor changes in your system. Now, as you can imagine, this is a gold mine for all kinds of rent seeking. And that is precisely what used to happen. Low-level inspectors would go in there and essentially extract rent. Enormous amounts of compliance requirements and energy had to be, and we did a survey, something like 70% of the compliance management time of IT BPO type companies were actually put in trying to comply with these rules. And in 2 rounds, we finally got rid of them. And you may have seen in the years 21 and 22, there was a sharp increase in our services exports. It had a lot to do with these OSP reforms. So this is the kind of reforms that we do. Boring reforms, nobody cares about them, but you have to do them one by one. Another example, which we are now currently doing, is about cleaning up our patenting system and getting it to expand dramatically. So we all want India to be, in the knowledge economy and so on. And yes, we are indeed a major player in the global knowledge economy. Nonetheless, it will shock you to know that as recently as 2016, India only issued 9,000 patents a year. Okay? Across all sectors, 9,000 patents a year. So we began to improve the process and began to clean it up, hired more people, and so on. And that number has gone from 9,000 to last year somewhere in, I think, 34,000 patents. I will say, wonderful job, dramatic increase, no doubt, from 9,000, few years, you have gone from 9,000 to 34,000. But just to put it in context, the US does more than 350,000 patents a year. And China does 500,000. Now, you can argue that quite a few of the patents that China does are of poor quality utility patents. Nevertheless, you can weed it out how you wish, but at least they are doing somewhere in the range of 100,000 to 150,000 decent quality patents a year. If we want to compete in that world, we've got to really up our game. And so last year, the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister issued a report a little more than a year ago. And as a result of this, major reforms are being done in the patenting and also in the trademark and copyright space as well. Large numbers of, literally hundreds of new examiners and controllers are being hired, the processes are changed, the artificial intelligence is being introduced, and so on. And we expect that in 18 months' time, we will have the capacity to do up to 1 lakh patents a year. So, again, another example of process reform. Until it happens, nobody will even notice it, and perhaps it will happen so organically that in the end, nobody will even notice the fact that it has actually happened and will begin to accept that that is the norm. But these are the kinds of reforms that we need to pay attention to. And again, an example that's already in process. Now, before I end, I'll give you an example of a reform that we are now going to embark on, which is the reforms in legal metrology. Now, how many of you even know what legal metrology is? One person here, 2, 3. Okay, so slightly better than OSP reforms. Now, it may come as some surprise to the rest of you that this is one of the biggest problems in India's ease of doing business. So what is legal metrology? Legal metrology relates to those rules, regulations related to weights, measures, and labeling. Okay. Now, we have all kinds of extremely complex rules and regulations relating to all of this, and they keep changing all the time. As a result, if you're a business person, you'll have a real tough time keeping up with, say, for example, the labeling laws. There are very specific laws about how big the font should be, how the spelling should be, and even small infractions, you can get into real trouble with the metrology inspectors, who are a very active bunch of people, as you can imagine, because the Legal Metrology Act also in India criminalizes many of these offenses in a very peculiar way. It says that the first instance, when you are caught, you will pay a penalty, and usually a small penalty, which people are willing to pay. But in the second instance, you can be sent to jail for as long as 7 years. So now guess what happens? Every year, about 1 lakh instances of metrology violations are recorded. 1 lakh, right? But guess how many second instance metrology violations happen? In an average year, it's about 12. So I can tell you, you know how many acts of rent seeking happen every year? 1 lakh minus 12. So what you really need to do is to decriminalize them. And we are about to decriminalize one part, which is about 1/3 of them, some of these provisions, which is be a part of the Jan Vishwas bill, which is already in Parliament. And the other 2/3 will have to be taken a little more carefully, because we also need to balance it with consumer protection. So we don't want to completely open it up. But nevertheless, we will significantly decriminalize them. The net result of that, both of this, will be that a major source, perhaps the single biggest source of rent seeking by lower and mid-level officials and inspectors, will be removed as a result of this. So I've given you 3 examples, something that we have already done, something that is in process, and something that we will do in the very near future. And hopefully you'll appreciate that this is a class of reforms that needs genuine attention. There are literally hundreds, not thousands, of such reforms that we can do. Many of them are not ideological at all. As Dr. Virmani said, all you really need is micro-level data and see whether or not it is this particular legislation process, etc., is getting in the way, and make small changes. Along the way, if that begins to cause a different has unintended consequences, then see what those consequences are and change again. And through a feedback loop, you could keep making progress. There is no reason to have strong ideological views in either direction in any of these. After all, what ideology is there in terms of improving the speed at which patenting works, or the legal metrology system works, or removing rent seeking? So, again, an example of something that we have evolved over time. And this, since I happen to also deal with a lot of countries around the world on trade negotiations and many other aspects, G20 and so on, this is something, by the way, that needs to be done systematically in every level of country. It certainly needs to be done in other developing countries, but there are many, many things that need to be done even in developed countries in this space. So with that, let me hand it back to you, Charan.
We'll have question answer session at the end, and we'll all have an opportunity to seek clarifications from the speakers. Just because of paucity of time, I need to move on. And Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, I totally agree with you. When we were setting up the think tank EGRO, that's exactly what we thought. There are many things which the advanced countries have to look at India, and many in the least developed countries have to learn and look at India. So I totally agree with what you said. I should also mention that you should have the paper that he published in Economic Times on the legal metrology. This is sometimes in May this year. And it's very, very clear as to what he is talking. So thank you so much for this. Yeah. And I would now like to invite Dr. Surjit Bhalla. He is going to be talking to us about poverty and unemployment, both the topics that were mentioned by Dr. Virmani when he made the presentation. Sir.
So I'll talk about something not as controversial as reforms. I will talk about what have been the effects and what do we know about the effects of the economic reforms that have taken place. Now, if you've been involved in any way with the Indian economy, especially in the media, that there are two very, very controversial subjects as to what has happened to poverty and what has happened to unemployment. Amongst various other things, there is what has happened to economic growth, what's happened to exports, imports. We'll see what's happened to manufacturing. But I will concentrate on just these two small issues as to what has been the effects of reforms and development as measured by what has happened to extreme poverty and what has happened to unemployment. Now, you know, it is a battle of narratives. You have a narrative that not much has changed in the last 10 years or so in terms of poverty reduction. There is a competing narrative, which is that there has been substantial progress made in terms of poverty reduction. So it is a job of economists to try and filter through the data to find out as to what has actually happened. Now, in the case of poverty, it is very, very important that we understand what the definition is. You come up with a definition of poverty and you can show that it has gone up, it's gone down, or whatever. So let's just stick to simple definitions. And I will talk about two of them and the effect that the definitions have on our understanding of poverty. You have the multidimensional index of poverty. And I will confess to not understanding fully what the multidimensional index does, but nevertheless, it has come out with the UN, the NITI Aayog has also adopted it, and so on and so forth. All I want to point out is one very simple statistic about multidimensional poverty, as well as the competing measure of poverty, which is the absolute index of poverty, which has been actually, India was the first country to come up with the absolute definition of poverty. This was Montek Singh Ahluwalia back in the 70s when he was at the World Bank, based on Indian data, and there was a Dandekar-Rath poverty line and so on and so forth. But the absolute index of poverty is very, very straightforward. It is, are you consuming X amount, or are you spending, your consumption is X amount or higher? If it is lower than X, and you determine what the X is. That's not debatable here. But you define what the X is, and actually economists have gone to great lengths to define what the appropriate level, but the definition is very, very straightforward. You're above the line, above the poverty line, your consumption, you're not poor. If you're below the poverty line, you're poor. Now, how do I determine what your consumption is? Well, you do it through a survey. And we've had, NSS has been a real pioneer in surveys, started in 1951 when the first survey was done. And there the consumption, they went to households and found out that how much did you consume of rice, of wheat, of salt, and various other items on a 30-day basis. So they asked them, look, how much did you spend on each item over the previous 30 days. Seems quite simple, seems quite straightforward, and indeed it was simple and straightforward. Until the mid-90s, when research around the world showed that basically what the recall period is, whether you ask them how much did you consume in the last 30 days, which was the standard, or for fruits and vegetables and perishables, eggs, meat, etc., how much did you consume in the last 7 days? And obviously for consumer durables, how much do you consume over the last 365 days? So you see the same thing, all we are concerned with is your consumption, but we ask you whether it was over the last 30 days or 7, 30, and 365. Why is that important? Well, over the last 4.5 years, the multidimensional index of poverty shows that 135 million people became non-poor. So given that definition, over the last 4.5 years, 135 million people were classified as non-poor. Okay. Now, in terms of the simple definition of whether I ask you 7 days, 30 days, 365, as I just mentioned, in 2011, they did, and in 2009, the NSS asked separately on a 30-day basis, and they found that 23% of the people in the population were poor. That very same year, the definition was on the 7, 30, 365, what I just mentioned. They did a separate survey, not the same people, and found out that only 13% of the people would be classified. Not over time. This is the same year, same time, more people were moved out of poverty because of this definition than the multidimensional poverty index over 4.5 years. So that is just to emphasize that, look, be very, very careful of definitions, and then you can proceed. Second, another big controversy, and that has to do with reforms, that, as have been mentioned by the previous speakers, we have been doing economic reforms since 1991. And, you know, there is a consistent history of reforms. At the same time, now some reforms were not done, some reforms are continuing to be done, and some reforms maybe will happen in the future. One interesting and objective question, which everybody asks and should ask, look, which reforms have been more productive in terms of poverty decline? You can have other measures. You can have economic growth. We'll see a paper on manufacturing growth, etc. But, you know, whatever the question, you always are interested in its effects. Now, one big debate in India, unfortunate debate, I would say, which is that it is tied to politics or tied to ideology. Well, you know, we had a different political regime from 2004 to 2013, and we have a different political regime, not a different regime, a different party undertaking the reforms. And so what has happened in those two periods? Both of them are approximately 9 years now. We don't have the data up to date, but we do have consistent data until 2011, 2004 to 2011, and from 2011 onwards, unfortunately, we don't have a national survey, but we do have other surveys. And what's the result there? And this is done, as you know, various people have been undertaking this research. Bottom line, there is no question that the pace of poverty decline in India was faster post-2011 than it was 2004 to 2011. Now, as I show on the slide, what we are looking at here, and this is just a matter, again, of measurement, of, I say, log decline, which is a percentage decline. Now, one way to measure performance of poverty is that there were 15% poor in year one and 10% poor in year two, so 5 percentage points decline. So you measure performance by how much is the absolute decline in the percentage. Think about what happens when you go from 3% to 1%. Actually, as it happens, it's very, very difficult to go from 3% to 1%, lot more difficult than to go from 30% to 20% or even 10%. So that is why the measure should be a log percentage decline, compound annual growth of decline, or whatever. But the point is you cannot take the absolute decline because it becomes, and if you do it in terms of percentages, again, you'll see from 3 to 1 is a huge, huge percentage decline. But I just want to measure, again, a point of measurement. Last thing I want to talk about is on employment. And actually, there's a slide here is where, I'm sure, sorry, the numbers are coming out. Maybe they don't come out too bad, which is a comparative decline of performance in India versus other countries. I want to move on to unemployment rates. Now, this is again something that is somewhat misunderstood, if I may say so. We look at the unemployment rates, and politically, it is very important as to what the nature of unemployment is. As it turns out, around the world today, youth unemployment is very high. Whether you look at China, whether you look at Europe, actually every country in the world barring the US. So US is a special case, we won't go there, but every country in the world there has been an increase in the unemployment rates of the youth. I have an attempt at an explanation as to why that is the case. And it has to do with the fact that around the world, education has seen a massive expansion, massive. It doesn't matter where you go. And the point is that the supply has far exceeded the demand, which is why you have more youth unemployment now around the world than at any time in history. But let's look at what happens to unemployment in India by different age groups. And what you see over here is that 15 to 29, first of all, we shouldn't be looking at even 15, 18, etc., because now everybody is going to school, or the enrollment in schools is up to about 90-95%. So therefore, at that age group, and even in colleges, one little statistic that is not understood, and I won't talk about women's enrollment or labor force participation, but there are more women students in colleges today than males in India. It also happens to be the case in most parts of the world, but in India, this is something unheard of, that there are more women in colleges than there are men. However, coming back to the unemployment, if you look at this, and I give 2 years, 2011 and 2021, and let's look at the age group 30 to 64. And what you find, the unemployment rate age 30 to 64 is about 1%. So in other words, once you get back the hump of the excess supply, it turns out that unemployment rates are very, very low. This is just for India, in the process of doing a study for other countries, but it is a remarkable, if you will, statistic for India. Now let's look at youth unemployment, and what you find is that 15 to 29, it's about 12% unemployment now, and it was 6% in 2011 when the economy was booming and so on and so forth. You find that there has been an increase of about 6 percentage points for the youth. If you take 15 to 24, similar. Bottom line here is that while unemployment is a problem, it is particularly a problem, only a problem in the age group of 15 to 29. Last point, I don't have the time, but the paper will have. There's a lot of controversy about women not being in the labor force in India. There are some statistics put out by a major sampling agency, CMIE, that shows that only 8% of women in the eligible age group are actually in the labor force. This number happens to be lower than what it is in Yemen. Indeed, it is the lowest in the world by a long, long shot. How that has gained currency, I leave it to you, but this is why it is exciting to work in India, because you do have estimates, credible estimates, which some academics will also put forward as to the labor force participation rate of women is only 8%. As it happens, the PLFS, which is the same thing as the NSS before, the labor force participation rate for women in 21-22, according to the usual status, was something like 34%. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would invite you to look at the papers by Dr. Surjit Bhalla. His paper at the IMF on poverty is a very important paper. It has been presented at eGrow webinar series. You're welcome to look at the paper and the presentation there. NITI Aayog has just come out with a report on multidimensional poverty, and at eGrow in October, most probably 20th of October, we'll be having a webinar on the multidimensional poverty. We'll keep you informed. You're welcome, and that's an online webinar. With this, yes, I also wanted to mention the points that Dr. Bhalla has made here on poverty reduction, substantial, and I think it's a lesson for the rest of the world how it has been achieved, especially the food program that was done during COVID. And otherwise, the world was thinking India is going to become the epicenter of global poverty, but how the programs of the government ensured that that does not happen. That's a very important public policy lesson which we have to learn. And Dr. Bhalla has now mentioned about the unemployment thing. And that's an equally important lesson on which lots of research needs to be done. Feminization of education has become very important. I was educated in Kerala, and at that point of time, I used to wonder the phenomena of feminization of education in Kerala about 30 years ago. But now I'm watching it happen all across the country. With this, I would now like to invite Professor Ramesh Chand, member NITI Aayog, to share his thoughts on rural development and agriculture. Sir.
Thank you, Charanji. In fact, when Professor Charan Singh approached me that I should be part of this exercise, I seriously started thinking that where and why we need new type of economic models, especially what is so-called Bhartiya model of economic development. Time is only 10 minutes. Maybe I'm not able to give you a background of many things. I hope you will understand if full background is not there for certain things. First, I come to where. I think when we talk of where we need Bhartiya model of economic growth, two sectors immediately come to my mind. One is rural sector and another is agriculture. And I will briefly share with you the reasons that why these two sectors require to be treated differently, especially now. But that doesn't mean that in the past, whatever we have done in these two sectors was not good. But I will share with you some of the facts which necessitate that in order to harness best potential of these two sectors, which is in the future interest of Indian economy, we need to have a different kind of model for these two sectors. That can be Bhartiya economic model or something related to that. Another reason for discussing these two sectors is that among all the sectors, if there has been something Bhartiya, that has been highest in these two areas, not so much in manufacturing, urban, and other kind of area. There you just find that we need to have for manufacturing Western idea of industry, Western machinery, and like that. But in these two sectors, you just find that mostly the development approach had its root in what we call Bhartiya. Now I come to this issue of why we need new model in these two sectors. Friend, if you look at data, you just find that up to 2004-05, share of rural economy in the total economy, as reported by CSO in the NDP, net domestic product of rural and urban, was showing decline. But you then find that at the beginning of 20th century, the rural economy, we have data up to 11-12 only, after that we don't have data. The growth rate of rural economy was 7.4%, and it was slightly higher than what was the growth rate of urban economy. So why it happened and how it happened? In the 20th century, not strictly 2001, around that time, I feel we started deindustrializing urban areas. We started moving industry out of cities to remove congestion in city. City were not able to absorb pollution of industry and couple of other reasons. So we started moving industry. It's not that industrial activity started happening on its own in rural area. So one reason is that we started moving industry out of urban location to rural location. And secondly, whatever new industry was coming, it didn't have land in urban areas, so it has to be in the rural locations. So because of these two reasons, if you look at some of the figures for the recent period, that is 4, 5, and 11, 12, you get some number which are startling. I've written a paper on this, it is in EPW. Between 5 and 12, growth rate of agriculture in rural India was 4.3%, and growth rate of manufacturing NDP was 15.87% per year. Imagine that rural area industrial growth started at 16%. But did we prepare rural area for this kind of industrialization? Did we create infrastructure? Did we create possibilities that rural people will get employment in these kind of things? The answer is no. If you compare this growth rate of manufacturing with growth rate in employment, the growth rate in rural employment in manufacturing in this period was only 0.67%. So you see the contradiction that manufacturing growth in a rural area increased so much, but it was what people call jobless kind of growth in rural area. And we all know that future industrialization is also largely going to happen in rural areas. Therefore, we need different kind of models for rural industrialization than we have followed in the past, which is more inclusive, and it can be more inclusive only if it gives job. Job is the mechanism through which you create inclusiveness. Then the second big change which happened in the rural setting, that till then, most of industrial production was happening in rural area, but in 11-12, 51% of total industrial GDP, NDP, was generated in rural area, only 49% was generated in urban area. So rural base became much stronger, industrial base became much stronger in rural area than in the urban area. As a result of that, many people treat agriculture and rural as synonym. They are not. 96% of agriculture is produced in rural areas, but only 39% of rural economy in 11-12 was agricultural. And if I project the figure, the current figure will not be more than 30%. So rural economy became 70% of it as of today is non-agriculture than agriculture. That again implies that we require a different kind of model for future rural development than the model of the past, which were dominated, that if you do something in agriculture, then rural society grows, rural people grows. No, you have to do something to the rest of the 70% also. Only then you can see that rural will grow to right way. Another set of data which is more recent, which Professor Bhalla also shared with us, that is data on employment, which is more recent. That is PLFS data. It is now available for 5 years, 17, 18, 18, 19, and up to 2021-22. It is available separately for rural and urban, annual data. Quarterly data is only for urban. I'm not going into this debate whether that data is accurate or whether data is reliable or unreliable, but I would like to share some of the numbers that I calculated from that data. That data says that in the last 5 years, which are the most recent 5 years, 87% of new employment opportunities were created in rural areas. Only 13% were created in the urban area, whereas in rural area, as per the latest figure, only 65% population lives. 35% live in urban area. So you just find that we always used to say labor will move out of rural area to urban area, from agriculture to non-agriculture. But the change which we are witnessing, that as much as 83.5% of new worker joined workforce in rural area. The second startling figure is that of these 87%, 69% were female workers. So again, it's not that women are joining workforce in proportion to their population. It is much more than in proportion to their population. Further, 57% of total employment created in the country in the last 5 years, it happened in agriculture. So again, if more than half of the employment is happening in agriculture, I think we need to see, can we improve condition of employment in agriculture? Can we improve remuneration, remunerative basis in case of agriculture? There are so many other things, but I would like to share with you one last number, and that is that 83% of new workers between 718 and 2021-22 are in self-employed category. Only 11% are in casual labor and 6% in regular wage and salaries. I can say that to some extent we started this skill mission in India. Prime Minister strongly emphasized that people should be job creator, not job seeker. So you just find that there is a sort of reflection of that in this case also. But again, much of that is happening only in rural area. As a result of that, you just find rural-urban divide, that more regular wage, salary kind of jobs getting created in urban area and self-employed kind of job getting created in a rural area. So I feel that with this kind of changes happening in rural economy, in agriculture economy, we certainly need to give rethink to the model on our economic thinking. There are many things related to agriculture, but again, hurriedly I will share with you two numbers which probably you will agree that we need to give more and new kind of importance to agriculture. The growth rate of agriculture in the last decade is 4%, which is unprecedented. India never realized 4% growth rate for 10 years in any of the decade before that. So this is another kind of achievement. But along with that, another development which happened, that we often say we want to make India global power, we want to make India global power through manufacturing. In fact, India is moving in a direction of becoming global power through agriculture. India's share in global GBA of agriculture in 5-6 was 7%, today it is 13%. Imagine 7% to 13%. And if we have to maintain this kind of trend in future, take it to 25%, we certainly need to do couple of things in agriculture, make agriculture sector more competitive, also make agriculture supply chain more competitive, because my calculation shows that if 4% growth in agriculture continue in future, then we need to export 25% of incremental output. That will not have domestic market. So lot of exciting things happening in rural sector, in agriculture sector, which to my mind require centrality, that rather than always talking that paying attention to so-called modern sector, industry, service, I think rural area and agriculture deserve a much different treatment. Probably, I hope that will be possible through, but Dr. Virmani is developing Bhartiya model of economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this very enlightening thoughts on the rural and agriculture sector, which is very different from the general perception all of us have. I would invite you to read his paper From Green Revolution to Amrit Kal, just published in NITI Aayog policy paper series. And of course, he has mentioned is published in the EPW, and would welcome you to read those. Very interesting, and I think the self-help groups which are doing a great job in Indian rural areas, and the Prime Minister now talking about the agri drones for the women there, is only going to give further impetus to female employment in the rural sector. Just because of paucity of time, I'll keep moving, and I would now like to invite Mr. Ajay Shakar, former Secretary, DIPP, to speak to us about India's energy transition.
India has been undergoing two extraordinary energy transitions, and I would briefly talk about both. So I will begin with the reply that I drafted to an unstarred Parliament question as a Joint Secretary, maybe around 2002. And the question was, how many years would it take Bihar to complete village electrification? And the answer was over 710 years. So I said, this is a horrendous typo. I mean, how can it be true? So then I was told to talk to the chairman, Rural Electrification Corporation. And he said, Ajay, he was my senior in service. He said, Ajay, I'm being a good civil servant. I have taken 10 years data, but I have taken 5 years data. I would have said that it will take the same number of years to fully de-electrify Bihar. Then more substantive numbers. We had more people without access to electricity in India than sub-Saharan Africa. Over 600,000 villages, we had about 125,000 unelectrified villages. And the International Energy Agency used to say, usual scenario building which agencies do, business as usual, we will complete village electrification by 2050. A little better performance, better ambition, 2040. Now, this is a transition which is really unprecedented in human history. 125,000 villages electrified, over 500 million people getting access to electricity, and we are almost achieving the reality of reliable 24/7 supply of electricity across the whole of India. Now, this is an extraordinary transition and it's nearing completion. I would draw attention to some of the features, or as Arvind said, pragmatism, which enabled this transition to happen. So one was a decision that, because the bulk of this unelectrified population was in the lower Ganges Valley, and therefore the pragmatic decision was taken that though till then it had been a state subject, the government of India would fund it to the extent of 90%. And the other major departure was, and I wish it is replicated in some other areas, that it would not be normal central government funding to the state government and executed by the state agencies. The funding was done through the Rural Electrification Corporation, and it was funding for the implementation of turnkey projects, which gave us outcomes. And the central government agencies, including NTPC, were utilized to make this happen. And the next phase was even more dramatic, which is that every household got access. And a younger colleague said that in UP, when he had responsibility for doing it a few years back, I think they created a kind of record in being able to take electricity to so many homes in such a short period of time. But in today's context, the other transition that India is attempting or undergoing is even more ambitious and is beginning to succeed. So this is a transition to meet the challenge of climate change and to create a green energy system, a green economy. So again, going back to early 2000, there was a GOM group of ministers wanting to set up a minimum share of renewable energy in the Indian electricity system. And we all fiercely opposed it. We thought it was the West pushing us to do something more expensive and what we couldn't afford. And the GOM decided that we will do no such thing. Then comes the Electricity Act 2003, and it is nebulous. It says regulators can fix shares for renewable energy. Then we have the launching of the National Solar Mission, and when it was launched, everybody thought that 20,000 megawatts of solar power by 2020 was unrealistic, unlikely to be achieved. And our position then was and remains that our right to development is primary, and this is something where we will do what we can do, and we'll try to do our best, but it's for the West to do what needs to be done. But starting with Paris, we have been increasing our ambition in ways which the world has not expected. So looks at the memoirs of Obama and his colleagues. They thought getting India to agree in Paris was a major diplomatic achievement. But today we are a country which has achieved what we had promised in Paris to achieve by 2030. So we are ahead by many years. And the Prime Minister surprised the world in Glasgow when he said that in 2030 we will have 500 GW of non-fossil fuel capacity. Now, against that target or ambition of 20,000 megawatts, we have now well over 50,000 megawatts of solar power. We have a lot of wind power, and 10% of our electricity comes from renewables today. And this is rising dramatically. And in fact, if one takes one kind of hard view, then the cost of renewables in India is the lowest in the world. The cost of storage has come down dramatically, and government has been very forward-looking in the last 1 year in coming out with policy guidelines on pump storage, which will enable electricity generated from solar and wind to be stored and to be used at night when the sun does not shine. And there is a surge of private investor interest in pump storage also today. So if one looks at sheer numbers discovered through the price, India does not need to build a single new thermal power plant today. Now, 5 years back, I would have said this is out of the question. 2 years back, I would have said you are dreaming. But today, these are the numbers that we have discovered through the market. And if we succeed in pump storage, we would be global leaders in electricity storage in the world, because nobody has a large pump storage program on the anvil in the world. Now, 500 GW of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030 has to be seen in the context of our total capacity being only 350 GW today. So this is an enormous increase in ambition, and I think we are on track to achieve this. Now, if we look at being success in being able to store electricity and generate green electricity, then we can easily look at a situation where additional demand will be fully met by fossil fuel-free electricity, and then someday we can think of retiring the existing fleet. And we will be on the global frontier. And if we succeed with storage, then we are going to be on the global frontier there. And in parallel, we are seeing the success of electric vehicles in our country. Again, a success greater than what I had thought possible 3-4 years back. So you can have two parallel tracks. One, electricity getting decarbonized, surface transport getting decarbonized, and a major sector of the economy getting decarbonized. So decarbonization of electricity and surface transport is the enormous energy transition that appears realistic, feasible, and is going to happen. How long, I won't sort of hazard a guess, but it's happening. But then I think we did something which is probably extraordinary, which is that we decided to take a deep breath and be ambitious and start a national hydrogen mission. Now, the green hydrogen mission is ambitious in its scope, and I have a feeling that given the enormous depth of creative talent and ability in the technologies, we are going to succeed there. Because we have started on a frontier technology field along with the rest of the world. So nobody in the world today has a head start advantage over us in the production and the use of green hydrogen. So we are beginning with the advanced industrial economies in technological development which would enable decarbonization of the hard-to-abate sectors. Now, hard-to-abate sectors means sectors where you cannot do without the use of fossil fuels and manage by substituting fossil fuels with electricity. Because there are certain sectors where you need much higher temperatures than you can get through electricity, and these are hard-to-abate sectors, and also in transport, you have civil aviation and shipping and things like that. So we are with the rest of the world in the ambition to be on the global frontier, and I think given the young talent we have, we would be with the rest of the world in this frontier technology. And if by the end of this decade we are successful, not only in the production of green hydrogen, which we will be. Our largest groups have announced that they're going to do so, but in downstream uses. Downstream uses are fertilizer, steel production, and so on, so forth. So then we would be well positioned to achieve net zero quite easily. Our national commitment is 2070, but I have a feeling that if we succeed in the hydrogen mission, and I won't be surprised if we succeed as fast as anybody else in the world, then we would be in a position to technically and financially get to net zero much faster than 2070. My personal dream and hope and ambition has been that we do it in 2047, the 100th years of our independence. And if in 2047 we are net zero, I think we will be really proud of what we've done, and the rest of the world will owe us a great debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ajay Shankar. This energy issue is becoming really important, and the way you've mentioned it, it's a challenge, and how we are overcoming it. Let me move on to Professor Golder now. We have heard from Professor Ramesh Chand on rural development and agriculture and the distinction between the two. Let's listen about industry. Professor Golder.
Good afternoon. I will discuss about industry. So I begin from our first plan. So if you look at this period, we can divide period till now into three parts, 1950 to 1993. This is the, we can say, pre-economic reform. 1994 to 2007, that is just before the global financial crisis. And 2008 to 2021.
We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, now it's okay. And in these three periods, the growth rates were as shown here, 5.7, 8.2, and then 6.4. 6.4 was the growth rate from 2008 to 2021, and I'll focus on this period. If we compare India's growth rate with other countries, you will see India has an outstanding performance. I am comparing all countries which have at least 1% of the global value added in manufacturing. India, you will see there are two bars. One is 6.4, which was the thing I showed you based on national account statistics. The other one is 8%. That is, I am saying we need to adjust this number for some reasons I will give you shortly. Actually, India's manufacturing sector growth is about 8%. It is more than the growth rate of GDP by at least 1% more. And some of people may feel surprised because they must have seen articles saying that share of manufacturing in GDP is not growing, but I'm saying growth is about 8%. Even if we compare among Asian countries, India is again outstanding and compared to most. Now let me move to the reason why we need to adjust it upward. One reason is that many countries, not many, several countries of the world use what is known as double deflation method for national accounts, like Japan, US, France, Germany. And if we use that method, which is considered appropriate, and I'm showing you two lines you can see. One is based on double deflation, other is based on single deflation. The double deflation raises our growth rate by about 1.3%. So this is one adjustment that is needed. Second is look at this one. This is the growth rate of the information technology and communication equipment industry. Now in this industry, if you look at the line upper, that is the deflator that we currently use in national account statistics. Incidentally, wholesale price index of this is also growing. But look at this price of iPhone 8, 64 GB. 2017 it cost 64,000 rupees. 2023 it cost 39,000. Actually, price of iPhone has fallen. Actually, if you think carefully, the price at which you bought your mobile 3 years ago, same money you can buy a better mobile. Prices of mobiles are falling. Prices of laptops are falling after adjusting for quality. But the deflator we use shows prices are rising, which is wrong. So if we use the correct deflator, which is shown here, then our growth rate goes up by 0.3%. Actually, for this sector, currently the deflator in national account statistics is 19% per year, but it should be 34% per year using the correct deflator for this sector. This shows the India's growth rate of GDP, and you can see India's growth rate of GDP is 6.4%. Of the 6.4%, 4.4 comes from more labor and more capital. 2% comes from more productivity. But of this 2% more productivity each year, 0.8% is contributed by manufacturing, which is the major contributor. So I'm basically trying to build a story that manufacturing is a very dynamic sector in India, and it is making a major contribution to the country, and manufacturing is growing in this country at the rate of 8% per year. This shows the other side, equity or inclusiveness of growth. This shows the share of the unorganized sector in employment in manufacturing. Almost always 75% or more. Only recently it has slightly gone down. But so this shows this is what we call inclusive industrialization, which is of course one of the theme of this. This diagram shows shares of different size. These are too small. I don't know if you may be able to see. The first one is 1 to 3 worker unit, then 3 to 5 workers, and so on up to the end. The important thing to see is that 1 to 3 worker unit or 1 to 5 worker unit, together they account for almost 60%. This data for 2050, 60% of the workers. But their productivity level are very, very low. On the other hand, the other side, say 500 or 2,000 workers or per unit, per factory or more, their productivity level are high, but the share in the total employment is low. Why I'm showing this is, we have one group which are highly competitive, they could export, we can say go and conquer the world markets. And the other side, these are for job creation and livelihood. So we have both parts in the industrial sector, very efficient, very competitive, and less efficient, but job creating. That is, so I can call this CGE model in a way. Competition, competitiveness, growth, one group, equity, another group. Now this group, which is, I should say, relatively less competitive, and I just have to say one thing before I proceed. Now, you saw that about 60% of the people are in the 1 to 5 class. You may say this is happening everywhere. No, it's not true. In other countries, this size class, the shares are much less, but I think we can come back in case it's needed in the question at a time. What this table shows is that there is a process of formalization taking place in our country. The lowest size class, people are becoming over time bigger in size and thereby gaining economies of scale and efficiency. This comes out most clearly in this table, which shows that in 2021, which is a period in which COVID was affected, 21-22, COVID affected year, but look at this size class, 10 to 19 workers industries. Growth rate of employment, 20% in 20 and 30% in 1 year in 2021. What is the source of this such fast growth of employment in this size class? Actually, it is the smaller size class units which are growing into bigger size and feeding into this cell. And this is the root. This is basically reflecting a process of formalization of informal sector that is happening in our Indian economy. Now, how could India achieve a very rapid growth of 8%, as I'm claiming, and inclusive development, high share of the informal sector, and over time, growing formalization of the informal sector? What would be the factors? So I have listed here 3 factors. One factor is many millions of households coming out of poverty and thereby creating demand for goods which are affordable. And these affordable goods are made by the unorganized sector, 1 to 550 workers. These many goods which are needed for relatively low, poorer sections of society. As people come out of poverty, their demand grows very fast. And this is further supported by priority sector lending and some portion of the public procurement being earmarked for them, and so on. The second factor which has been responsible for this sort of development in India is the MG-NREGA program. The MG-NREGA program has forced the wages to go up, what we call reservation wage in the industry to go up. As the reservation wage in the industry has gone up, there has been a pressure on the industrial wages to go up, industrial income to the laborer to go up, and it creates a force or pressure on these relatively small units. Since they have to pay higher wages, they need to increase productivity. And then it becomes necessary for them to formalize or go to formal sector. The third factor which has helped us in this is that India has a relatively low level of participation in global value chain. If we had high, then we could not be domestic sourcing. We could not create so much demand for domestic producers. So we had a really fine balance here. And because of the low level of domestic participation, and most of the manufacturing firms in India have either no participation in global value chain or shallow participation. Only a minority has got deep participation. And this perhaps comes out clearly from this diagram. This plots the different countries according to the level of GVC participation and the growth rate achieved. The x-axis I am measuring foreign value-added share in exports as a measure of global participation. And you can see that if you think of a trend line, we are just at the topmost portion of the trend line, as if we have reached a GVC level, GVC participation level, which is growth maximizing. Again, this may be contested, but this is my view on this. I can show another diagram, very similar, which uses what is known as the GVC participation rate computed by ADB. Again, the same diagram. India is almost at the point where the growth is maximum. So in a way, we have somehow come to realize that level of GVC participation, which is the growth maximizing. This diagram shows what is the level of domestic sourcing and what is the level of among the foreign companies in India and domestic companies in India. You will notice that all the domestic factories which do not have FDI have a much greater amount of domestic sourcing than the companies which have FDI. Now, how did these Indian companies which do not have FDI, do not have foreign link, are able to source most of it within India while others cannot? The reason for that, I am claiming, lies in the depth in the manufacturing that we have achieved over time. It is easier to develop the supply chains in India, and Indian companies which do not have FDI in them are much more eager and much more easily develop that. And this also shows one side of strength why we have been able to maintain relatively low GVC participation. Oh, sorry, there is something else. Finally, I have to say one thing. That is, commonly you will read in the newspapers that Indian share of manufacturing in GDP is not growing. But here I have said Indian share in the GDP has not grown. But how is it that in the presentation I made, Indian growth rate of GDP, manufacturing GVA, gross value added, was so fast? Then isn't there a contradiction between that? If manufacturing is really growing at 8% and GDP is growing at 6.5%, shouldn't the manufacturing share in GDP keep on growing? So there is a contradiction. So to show this contradiction and explain this contradiction, I show you a diagram. And with that, I think I will stop. Now, before I show this diagram, I think I have to explain to this. If you think the biggest revolution in India last 10 years, last 12 years, I think is internet and mobile. Almost every hand mobile has reached. The amount of data that we used to consume today, compare that with the data we used to consume 10 years ago, 15 years. So in volume terms, this service has grown one of the fastest. So you would expect that this service, which you can call telecom service, share in GDP must have grown, but actually it has not grown. That is what this diagram shows. If you look at the blue line, this is the telecom share in GDP, in we can call market services GDP. This shows a fall. And why does it show a fall? Because at one time you just think what were the call rates and what are the prices for your data. Today the prices, the values have come down so much that when you measure at current prices, the share of this sector, which is the
panel, talking to distinguished scholars, senior administrators. I must say that adoption of mixed economy in India manifests in much more significant way in the urban sector. That development, as I said, is a state sector. State government is responsible for forming policies, programs, passing laws and orders. But beside that, it also identifies the statutory towns. Several state governments have made more inclusive urbanization by identifying small towns in backward areas. Now, inclusivity also comes through decentralization. 74th Constitutional Amendment empowered the local bodies. Although urban development is in the state sector, different states have different degrees of empowerment of the local bodies, but that I think was a very, very significant step in inclusive urbanization in India, because the powers to a large extent, at least theoretically, were transferred, not only of governance, but also planning to the urban local bodies. Now, central government role in urban development is supposed to be policy making, housing policy, urban development policy, and for example, infrastructural development designs are prescribed. Even master plan was prepared, Delhi master plan, and that was adopted in large number of urban centers. Although theoretically, role of central government is very limited to do policies and giving broad directions, and some central sector project and centrally sponsored project. But if you analyze the amount of funding which has gone from the central government to the urban sector is significant. And the major programs have come up, JNNURM, smart cities, heritage programs, urban livelihood missions, housing for all, and also Swachh Bharat mission, which really made a significant impact in the urban sanitation programs. Another thing which has happened in the urban sector is mixed economy means emergence of the private organizations, sector organizations. Not only that the private corporate sector has come to play a significant role, many of the public agencies have been told that they should have efficiency criteria, cost recovery criteria to be brought into the core of their functioning model. George Bernard Shaw's statement, why don't the women behave like men? That came up, why don't the public sector behave like the private sector? So in many cases, this injected efficiency. And some kind of accountability came in, because in the resource allocation, it was felt that, look, you can't just do a gap-filling approach, you have to have some kind of an accountability. That was certainly a positive thing in this neoliberalism which came up. But what happened is this neoliberal environment where you are asking for accountability, cost recovery, large cities benefited a lot. Special purpose vehicles came up, or these parastatal agencies came up for infrastructure, housing development. In the housing sector also, large amount of private money was coming in. And in smart city mission, it was envisaged that 30% will come from the public sector, 70% will come from the private sector. So that led to large cities getting maximum benefits. And many of the large cities which helped India in getting globally linked, that certainly was a great advantage, and India's linkage got strengthened. But certainly the small and medium towns in the backward areas didn't get much benefit from this, and the government was concerned about it. Particularly, I know the present government shows significant concern for the infrastructural development in the backward areas. And that certainly has helped many of the small and medium towns. And also there are institutional mechanisms which has been devised both by the central level, there are parastatal agencies created by the central government as well as the state government, which provide funding to the small and medium towns, which provide technical support, pooled finance, so that individually a small town may not be able to approach the capital market, but together they approach, and that certainly has increased the inclusivity of the urban system in the country. Now, in fact, if you allow the private sector to come in a major way, there will be no discrimination on the basis of caste or religious factors, but there will be exclusion on the basis of affordability. And that was an issue which has been taken up by the government by creating state-level institutional mechanism which can provide infrastructural support, financing support, and technical support to the small and medium towns. Now, as I mentioned, that this challenge has been taken up by the central government in particular, although, as I mentioned, that central government's role theoretically was envisaged to be limited, but certainly in practice, in terms of funding, you do find central government has played a major role. But nonetheless, the country has seen as developing an inclusive and participatory approach to urban development, wherein government institutions at central and state level, private agencies, local communities through elected civic bodies are playing active role. Now, the strength of the Indian system, I must tell you, although a few cities have got stronger linkage with the global market, as Danny Roderick shows, that has resulted in many of the African countries and Latin American countries getting into premature deindustrialization. Happily, India has been able to avoid that. And Danny Roderick at the Harvard University clearly shows that India does not fall in this trap because basically of the federal system. The small and medium towns being supported through this institutional mechanism. Large number of small towns have emerged on the urban scene. And also it's a large country and the markets are developing unevenly in different parts. Article 19 of the Constitution allows free mobility of the people. So people can move from the less developed areas. In fact, in the recent decades, we do find there's a significant increase in the rate of migration, and that has helped. And I was looking at the latest data. There's a question on migration in the PLFS schedule. You do find that COVID, which affected migration trends significantly, people went back from the large cities to their rural areas in the less developed states. But within 6 months of the second wave, you do find 80% of the people are able to come back to the urban centers. Basically, such exigencies certainly affect in a short term, but the market, in a way, despite the fact that during the COVID period of 2 years period, I analyzed that at least 14 developed states have passed some kind of ordinance or trying to bring some legislation restricting the jobs at the lower categories for the local people. There are restrictions in Haryana, in fact in Punjab, in Gujarat, Karnataka. They have proposed, but nonetheless you do find that a market prevails in a big way and the economic disparities have been able to bring the people back within a period of 6 to 8 months. I know Charan Singh ji warned me to conclude in 10 minutes time. I'll just make two more points. I was just looking at it that is Indian urban morphology, has anything to do with our great visionaries, the classical thinkers, and whether that has to some extent affected our current system. Look at Arthaniti. Chanakya was always saying that there should be small townships coming up. He mentioned that there is no fixed limit for the population, but the moment, it depends on the territory, it depends also access to river, water and all that, but the moment population crosses a threshold level, which may vary from region to region, you should create new urban centers. And new urban centers will be created with relaxation in taxation and incentives. And that, I think, is something, as I mentioned, that the role of the state governments in identifying new urban centers is extremely important. Let me tell you, at least 14 countries in the world, there is no census town. It is only the government, even in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, urban centers are identified only with the concerned ministry in the government. The dynamics of the society which reflects in transformation of villages into urban centers is not being captured. So this is something I thought was extremely important. Well, Chanakya's Arthaniti is very deterministic. It specifies the size of the wall which should be around. Security was a major concern. But nonetheless, access to the urban center was available to everyone. With one important proviso that urban space must be allocated to different sections of the population. The mixed land use was something that he was not very much fond of. There will be areas where Brahmins will live, the recreation places, and also the commercial places where the traders can come in. For different sections of the society, there has to be enough space, and that is something which reflects inclusivity. But this inclusivity was linked with selectivity also. Cities must attract the talents, and that's why there should be taxation variation for different categories of people. When I look at the current situation in India, you do find that, well, Article 19 tells that migration should be free, but there are, residential colonies coming up. Public sector organizations offer their people, the really top talents get attracted, and they have housing facility. Coming to any big city, housing is a major issue. Similarly, there are governmental programs for different professional groups. Governmental programs are also there for the poor. So it is not really totally left to the market. State does come in and brings in selective inclusivity so that certain sections of the population, be it a professional class, be it the poorer sections, they are to an extent being brought in. And well, Prime Minister's Awas Yojana has certainly helped it, but one has to see to what extent the poorer sections have been able to come in. Last point. Ramesh Chand, I told him once that you take him out of agriculture, but agriculture can't go out of him. He talked about rural development. And that certainly is a very impressive story that he gave us, that much of what's happening is in the rural areas. Employment generation, income generation. But the question is, are we measuring urban population even, and urban sector activities properly? This is a question which has been raised by the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in a recent paper. And the argument there is that the progress of the Indian economy is not being properly reflected because one of the factors is underestimation of urban population. And it is indeed true, it's a serious concern, that National Sample Survey estimate of urban population is much less than what the expert committee set up by the Ministry of Health for the RGI, of which I was also a member, had given. So basically, urban figures are underestimated. And although the growth story that Ramesh Chandji gave is very impressive, and I really subscribe to that, but average level of indicators are higher in the urban areas. And if you multiply that higher figure with a lower weightage, then actually, obviously, the total will be underestimates. That is a valid point. But my submission is that, urban is not being captured properly. At least 22% of the urban population as given by the census towns, 22% as being governed by rural administrative setup, rural, local level authorities. And for the first time, 2011 census identified large number of those centers which are really urban. And I'm quite sure in 2025, hopefully, we have the census, and I'm sure you will find that many of these centers which are now considered to be rural, and that's where the growth is taking place, they will be part of the urban system. So that is something which is extremely important, and I personally believe that urban population estimates have to be correctly done. Otherwise, the concern that the Prime Minister Economic Council has said is absolutely valid. And I would like to tell you that not only that National Sample Survey gives a lower estimate, but nonetheless, National Sample Survey is not for getting the absolute figures. It is only for getting the ratios. But National Sample Survey urban population is much below than what the committee has projected. As I said, I was a member of the committee. For 8 months, there was no meeting, and the first meeting was held, and within a month, we had to submit the report because all the ministries are saying, we need this urban population, rural population breakup because our programs had linked with the population projections. So I think we did not do a very good job. And Prime Minister's Advisory Committee rightly points out that even the projections that have been made by the committee are on the lower side. Charan Singh ji talked to me and saying that, look, the estimate given by the World Urbanization Prospect for India is much higher than what the NITI Aayog is using, is higher than the projected figure. What do we do about it? So we prepared a paper, submitted to the NITI Aayog, and saying that the projection, not only these NSS figures, even the projections made by the government of India, which is used for all, as I said, all the ministries wanted the figure, are on the grossly underestimates. In 2036, for which government projections have been made, you compare with the World Urbanization Prospect figures. Both the reports are using the same model, logistic model. But the figures are at least 15% less, the official figures for the urban population, than the UN model. So we have given some kind of a better, robust estimate to the NITI Aayog. We have also given it to the Registrar General of India. And I hope that this would be done. I believe that we need reforms, whether it's a structural reforms or a process reform, I do not know, but the best way of bringing in reforms in the statistical system is not by debunking the existing system, not by discrediting, saying that we have not been able to do much in the last 70 years, but it should be a transcending to a higher level. It should be a continuous process. We are all aware, particularly the urban data, need rethinking, and certainly substantial amount of reworking needs to be done, but that has to be a continuous process, and I hope that would come through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kundu. We are towards the conclusion of the conference now. We have already run out of time, and I know I'm standing between the lunch and so therefore I'm going to be very, very brief in my presentation, maybe just 2 minutes, because I wanted to make 2 points here. The key point that I want to make is the reforms that we did in the country in recent years in the financial system, which is very, very complex in our country. And as you can see, that the numbers are very large when it comes to the cooperative banks, the non-banking finance companies, and then if you look at the overall structure, the commercial banks' role has been coming down, and that of the NBFCs has been coming up. NBFCs, the shadow banks, which have been a cause of concern across the world. Let me look at commercial banks. The point I want to make is, we all know that the global system went through high stress levels. And look at the non-performing assets, both gross and net. The good thing that Indian reforms did, and that juxtaposes perfectly well with what Dr. Virmani in his keynote address mentioned, no bank went flat. They were taken care, they were recapitalized, there was faith, there was guidance, and the banks probably merged in others. As a consequence to all those efforts, the non-performing assets have come down rapidly and amongst the best in the world. That is what I was mentioning when Dr. Virmani spoke about pragmatism and antyodaya. The capital adequacy ratios amongst the best of the best in the world, around 17% against a global yardstick of just 9%. That again comes from the government's policy, and I would like to make a special point here. It was just not the recapitalization of the banks that was taking place. The government, during its critical phase, also enhanced substantially capital expenditure. The priorities that the government demonstrated during this period, of course, then resulted in the highest growth rate across the world. One thing that helped during this whole procedure was the financial inclusive drive, which started in 2014. And this was a record-breaking drive. We were not only able to enroll 502 million people into the banking system. Out of that, nearly 279 million were females. And I think that's a great success. The other thing, the emphasis, if you look at, was in the rural and semi-urban area, where we were able to provide 335 million accounts to people compared to 166 in the urban areas. Consequent to this, between 2014 and 2021, the accounts that have been opened, households having an account, the numbers have increased dramatically. The technology part, which has also played a crucial role, is so clearly reflected here. The UPI of our country is now being sought after by many other countries in the world. The point that I am making is that the policies that the government has pursued in the last 10 years, with a clear objective of taking everyone along under the financial inclusion and using technology, so apparent. And the robust banking system that emerged through patience and through help has been sort of a role model for the financial sector in the world. With this, let me open the house for question answers now. Happy to take a question or two before we break for lunch. Yeah, Dr. Manoranjan Sharma had been asking early, so please keep your question very brief. As you know, we are all running out of time. Dr. Manoranjan Sharma.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, but we have a mic for you.
Thank you, sir, for an overall excellent discussion of the entire development spectrum. My brief query addressed to Dr. Sanyal is, he brought into focus two figures of 1 lakh and 12. My submission is that are you not ignoring the possibility in the second infraction of setting the house in order, greater compliance? First time, most of us have a tendency to make more mistakes. So while this 12 figure may be a gross understatement, it would be unrealistic, to my mind, to take a second also on an implicit basis. It could be 10,000, it could be 5,000, but the second time, going by anecdotal evidence, also by empirical, all of us tend to be more careful, more circumspect. Thank you.
I'm suggesting we take 2-3 more questions. Yeah, here, please. Yeah. Please be brief.
I am from the urban sector. My question, very thought-provoking statement made by Mr. Amitabh Kundu, inclusivity through decentralization. And we have been experimenting since 1992, 93, 73rd, 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. And let us be very frank, it has not worked. And we are under rapid transformation. So should we perpetuate with the colonial model of 20-year master planning? NCR plan and Delhi Master Plan 2041 have recently been published, so again for 20 years. But on the other hand, the Prime Minister's Gati Shakti Yojana and other smart cities, etc., are only for 5 years, where there is accountability, there is proper monitoring, proper adjustment with the changes. So this is my question, why we should not review the whole 73rd, 74th Constitutional Amendment Act and enact a new paradigm of urban planning.
Mr. Agarwal, right behind you.
My question is to Dr. Virmani. Is there any quantitative measurement of the inclusiveness of development in this Bhartiya model? And the second question is, where does sustainability stand in the Bhartiya model that Dr. Virmani is talking about? Thank you.
Thank you. Right behind you.
Yeah, my question is regarding poverty and unemployment. The way we have got our own interpretation of data in comparison to the rest of the world, the UN and IMF, and do you think it's going to be accepted by our data, the way we are presenting of hunger index or poverty and other things? And do you think this Bhartiya model will be prevailing the international forum, or the way they are giving their data, their representation is different, our interpretation is different?
I'll take 2 more questions, one right behind you and the last one here.
Okay, slight divergent to this, the universal basic income, is it possible to...
Sure, if we have time, we'll come on that. That's the last question we take now.
Yeah, I'm Deepak Maheshwari from ICRIER. So my question is to Mr. Sanyal. you did mention about the OSP liberalization, and in fact, I had written about this in October 2004, that this is something that should be permitted. But my question is that this OSP liberalization happened in a crisis, okay, more as a response to crisis rather than as a deliberate, conscious policy choice. So what is it that we should be doing more of this as a conscious policy choice rather than being driven only through an emergency response? Thank you.
I'm going to request my dear colleagues on the panel here, Dr. Virmani, Mr. Sanyal, and Professor Kundu. It's up to you. I would request you to be also brief, and then we break for lunch. Yes.
Thank you very much. Since two of the questions were directed at me, so I'll answer them. The OSP reforms, you're right. They had been accumulating from a long time. I wouldn't say there was a crisis as such in that. There was a COVID crisis, not an OSP crisis. But the reason we reformed it is actually, I'll tell you the actual story why. You see, the problem with these kinds of reforms is that they are in the woodworks. And nobody actually pays attention to them. And one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is the process reforms is something that there's almost no literature on. So I'll even tell you how I discovered this reform since I carried it out. I was then in the finance ministry. And an innocuous thing came out from the telecom ministry saying that these OSP requirements are going to be held in suspension so that people can work from home. So when I read it, so I had by this point worked long enough in government to know that when such a notification comes in, you should treat it with great amount of suspicion, because the fact that they are saying that work from home is now allowed till December 2020 suggests that in normal times they expect it to be applied. Now it seemed rather strange to me that in the year 2020, we should, we should have a situation where the telecom, the work from home or these kinds of EPA-BX type things should actually be in application. So as a result of which actually, that is the reason I took up these things. So yes, a crisis did cause me to find it, but not the crisis in OSP and in COVID, which allowed me to discover it. But the reason I gave this talk is precisely the point you're making. The reason I gave this talk is precisely the point I'm making, that structural reforms is a class of reforms that great amount of literature is there about. These reforms get almost no attention. Once in a while, some newspaper article will happen, something, maybe an interested researcher will take a issue up. But there is literally no research on this as a class of reforms. And hence my interest in bringing this up, that maybe we need to look at this as a class of reform, something to focus on, to get research going into this from academia, from think tanks, from government bodies, and hence the point. So the very point you're making is, isn't this something we should hammer away at? Absolutely, and hence my talk. Now about the other point, that has there been an improvement? Is this improvement happening because of improved compliance and so on? So we actually went through, and there's a report which we will publish in a few weeks' time. In order to do that, we researched the kinds of notifications that come on both sides. And the thing that really strikes you, both for the first, but also for the second instance, what are the notifications? It is extraordinary, the frivolousness of the cases that are placed. Very large number of them are essentially spelling mistakes, which are obvious, or gram not being full form but GM, or ingredient saying ingr and ... because there's no space in whatever that product is. So you'll be shocked the extent to which this kind of things are the infractions. So yes, there is the odd infraction where somebody is trying to sell something for 500 grams but is actually 400 grams, and you should definitely do something about it. But vast majority of the infractions are trivial labeling infractions. And so there is no doubt in my mind that a vast majority of those are related to some form of rent seeking, which, by the way, if you go and actually also talk to industry, etc., that is also what you will hear. In fact, the civil servants themselves accept that this is what goes on.
Professor Kundu, you want to say something? Anybody else? Yes.
Responding to your question, title of my paper is Challenges of Inclusive Urbanization. I'm not here to say everything has gone gaga and everything has succeeded. As far as the 74th constitutional amendment is concerned, which was for empowerment of the urban local bodies, I said that the different states have different degrees of success. And it is true that Class 1 cities have certainly been able to take advantage of this amendment, and also the neoliberalism which has come up. The institutions have started really directly interacting with the urban local bodies in planning, giving finances. Your special purpose vehicles have come up. And you do find that the Class 1 cities which had a stronger economy, which had land could be used as a resource, they have been certainly able to do that. And large number of small and medium towns, I did mention that they have languished, and efforts are being made in some of the states to really bring them within the fold of the overall economic development. But what I'm really happy about is that this neoliberalism in many African countries have led to premature deindustrialization. Many of the small towns have absolutely collapsed. This has not happened in India. There is some dynamism. There are local resources, local factors, and that has sustained our overall economic growth. And that is what makes me happy. But nonetheless, I absolutely agree with you that there is a long way to go as far as the strengthening the urban system, management and planning system, particularly in the less developed states and in the distant areas. Thank you.
I want to thank the guests on the stage, Dr. Arvind Virmani, member NITI Aayog, Professor Ramesh Chand, member NITI Aayog, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, member Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, Mr. Ajay Shakar ji, Professor Goldar, Professor Kundu, and all of you for such a stimulating interaction. It's been nearly 2.5 hours we've been here, and I really want to thank you for your patience. Absolutely beautiful lunch is waiting outside. I would request you to please have lunch before you go. Thank you very much.